Chapter 10: Process Preventive Controls for Human Food, Verification and Record Keeping, presented by David Rosson. Verification is the next essential element of the food safety plan. Verification is comprised of two elements: verification and validation, which is a verification activity. This chapter explores the concepts of verification and validation and procedures associated with verification activities. Verification is an important component of process, allergen, sanitation, and supply chain preventive controls. It confirms that the food safety plan is operating as intended. Validation confirms the effectiveness of the food safety plan in controlling food safety hazards. The purpose of verification is to provide a level of confidence that the food safety plan is 1, based on valid scientific principles that are adequate to control the hazards associated with the product and process, and 2, being followed correctly during operations. A preventive controls qualified individual must perform or oversee validation and review of records verification activity. This chapter covers elements of verification, including validation, calibration, product sampling and testing, and record review. All of these are verification activities. This chapter then covers record keeping. Accurate record keeping is an essential part of a successful preventive control system. This chapter details the records that are required under the preventive controls for human food regulation, general information required on these records, examples of implementation records, requirements for reviewing records, and record-keeping logistics. Regulatory implications related to the use of computerized records are also addressed. Sometimes verification and monitoring activities can appear to be the same thing. For example, an operator that is cleaning equipment may record observing the equipment is visibly clean as a monitoring activity prior to completing the task. A supervisor may then visually inspect the equipment as a verification activity, confirming that the equipment was cleaned. The important thing is that the activity is done and recorded, rather than what it is called. Both verification and validation are essential for an effective food safety plan. Routine verification is an ongoing process to provide evidence that the food safety plan is being properly implemented and is operating as intended. Validation is demonstrating that following the plan will actually control the identified hazards. Routine process verification are those methods, procedures, tests, and other forms of evaluation that provide additional evidence, in addition to monitoring, that the preventive controls are operating as intended. Verification essentially provides a double check of the system for additional assurance, rather than relying on just the monitoring activity. Validation, which is a verification activity, is obtaining and evaluating the scientific and technical evidence that the preventive control will be able to control the specific hazard. Validation should be done before starting the food process and implementing the food safety plan. Initial validation, and whenever a change to a control measure or combination of control measures could impact whether the control measure will effectively control the hazards. There are different types of verification activities that can be employed depending upon the food, type of process, and other factors. Verification procedures typically are ongoing procedures related to monitoring procedures and generally are scheduled activities such as weekly record reviews, e.g., to show that the oven temperature was at or above the temperature needed to kill the pathogen of concern, a daily accuracy check of a digital thermometer or of antimicrobial test strips for produce wash water, and checking the accuracy of the metal detector using metal standards. Some verification activities are done less frequently, such as periodic in-process or finished product testing, internal audits, or third-party audits. This also includes a reanalysis of the food safety plan when changes are made or at a given frequency to ensure the plan still reflects what happens at the facility. Validation, making sure that the process actually controls the hazard, is required for most process controls when hazards requiring a preventive control are identified. Examples of process preventive controls validation include ensuring that heating or cooling processes are sufficient to destroy pathogens in a given time frame, and that the concentration and antimicrobial used in produce wash water will sufficiently minimize microbial cross-contamination in the water. A formal validation activity may not have to be done by the facility if the parameter is based on a safe harbor. A safe harbor is when there is a scientifically valid, established, and recognized food safety parameter for control of the hazard. Safe harbor is explained in and discussed in this chapter. Process validation procedures. The purpose of validation is to provide objective evidence that process preventive controls have a scientific basis and represent a valid approach to controlling the hazards associated with a specific product and process. This includes demonstrating that the operational equipment can perform the control as designed and that the design parameters will control the hazard requiring a preventive control. Strategies that can be used to validate the food safety plan include using scientific principles and data from the literature, relying on expert opinion, conducting in-plant observations or tests at the limits of its operating controls, using mathematical models, and incorporating regulatory guidelines. Because of the scientific concepts involved in validation, this element of preventive controls must be performed or overseen by a preventive controls qualified individual. This person does not need to be an employee of the company. The Preventive Controls for Human Food Regulation specifies that validation is only required for process preventive controls. The regulation does not mandate validation of food allergen preventive controls, sanitation preventive controls, the supply chain program, or the recall plan. However, validating some of these other preventive controls may be beneficial, although not specifically required by the regulation. For example, product recalls have been associated with allergen cross-contact in products, so it may be worth considering the validation of cleaning procedures for difficult-to-clean equipment to assure that the cleaning procedures are effective in removing allergen residues, thereby preventing cross-contact. For other preventive controls, written justification that validation is not applicable to a preventive control may be prepared by the preventive controls qualified individual. This may be based on factors such as the nature of the hazard, the nature of the preventive control, and the preventive control's role in the food safety system. 21 CFR 1 17.160C5. Ideally, an initial validation of process preventive controls should occur before the food process begins. This may not be possible for specific aspects of validation, such as cases where process variation must be evaluated. Hence, continued validation activities to assess process capability may be necessary after the process begins. The Preventive Controls for Human Food Regulation requires that validation of process preventive control be completed within the first 90 calendar days of production or within a reasonable time frame, provided that a preventive controls qualified individual overseeing the validation prepares a written justification for a time frame that exceeds 90 calendar days after production of the applicable food first begins. Processors may want to hold product that is produced before validation data analyses are complete to ensure that the process control is effective in controlling identified hazards. Revalidation may be required if the process or product is changed in a way that may impact the effectiveness of the process. Reanalysis, as discussed later in the chapter, may also demonstrate the need for revalidation. There are many sources of information that can be used for process preventive control validation. It is important that the source of such information be credible and accurate, so reliance on peer-reviewed literature as well as guidance from regulatory agencies is a common practice. Additionally, trade associations and cooperative extension resources from land-grant universities can be helpful. Firms are responsible for confirming the applicability of this information to their specific situation. A safe harbor, critical limit of food process is a scientifically valid, established, and recognized food safety control. In most cases, safe harbors are published in federal performance standards, guidelines, or regulations by regulatory authorities, such as the FDA or the USDA FSIS. Other useful safe harbors that can be used to support critical limits or safe food processes include the FDA Food Code, the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance, PMO, and the Almond Board of California Nut Processing Guide. C. Additional reading and references in the chapter Resources. An example of the type of information that may be used to substantiate validation activities is the table in the slide, sourced from an Institute of Food Technologists report commissioned by FDA, IFT, 2001. This information is also in the FDA Food Code. An accepted data source such as this is sometimes called a safe harbor. The IFT table is based on a scientific evaluation of the potential for growth of or toxin formation by foodborne pathogens under otherwise ideal conditions. Products with a pH of less than 4.2 or a water activity, AW, less than 0.88, are not reasonably likely to support foodborne pathogen growth, even when products are held at optimum growth temperatures. Various combinations of pH and AW may also inhibit growth, but combinations such as a pH greater than 5.0 and AW greater than 0.92 require further study to preclude pathogen outgrowth, according to the table above. Safe harbor data are useful, but must be applied in the context of the product characteristics, pathogens of significance, and the process controls that are applied. A food establishment could use this table to support their conclusion that pathogen growth in their product is not likely if the product pH and AW combination falls in the no growth area of the table. For some products, the pH and AW parameters may be preventive controls that would require documentation, e.g., a formulated product. In others, where this is a natural characteristic of the product, e.g., salt and sugar have a natural low water activity. Vinegar has a naturally low pH. Management as a process. Preventive control is not necessary. It is also worth noting that in some cases where the product pH and AW combinations do not support the growth of a pathogen, but the pathogen may still stay viable should it contaminate the product and may still cause food safety issues to the product. The E.G. Food Company cooks its omelets to a temperature of greater than 160 degrees Fahrenheit, 71 degrees Celsius. This is an established operating limit for quality reasons, because the omelet batter must be congealed or set in order to transfer it to the assemble or wrap table, where the omelet is folded by hand and placed into a tray. The company worked with a consulting food safety expert to perform a validation study for its cooking procedure. The consultant conducted studies which showed the temperature of the omelet was always above 158 degrees Fahrenheit, 70 degrees Celsius, as measured using an infrared thermometer, when the omelet batter was congealed. The consultant wrote a report which is included in the Food Safety Plan teaching example. See Appendix 3. Process verification activities. Verification provides evidence to demonstrate that the food safety plan is working and being implemented as written. Several types of verification activities may be necessary for each preventive control to ensure that the procedures used are effective. Ongoing verification activities, such as calibration of process monitoring instruments and verification instruments to ensure their accuracy, and periodic in-process and finished product testing to verify process control, are important to show that the process preventive control is effective. Environmental monitoring is another verification activity to demonstrate that sanitation preventive controls are effective in facilities that produce ready-to-eat food that is exposed to the environment. This will be discussed further in Chapter 12. Sanitation preventive controls, supervisory review of monitoring, corrective action, and verification, e.g., calibration and product testing. Records is another type of verification used to demonstrate that these elements of the food safety plan are being implemented as intended. Verification of supply chain programs will be discussed in Chapter 13. Supply chain preventive controls. Routine accuracy checks and periodic calibration of process monitoring instruments and verification instruments are verification activities used to ensure that the measurements taken by these instruments are accurate and reliable. Accuracy checks and calibration are fundamental to the successful implementation and operation of the food safety plan. If process monitoring instruments and verification instruments do not provide accurate measurements, then monitoring results are unreliable. If a process monitoring instrument or verification instrument is found to be out of calibration, a process preventive control should be considered out of control, since the last documented acceptable accuracy check and calibration of that instrument. Corrective action should be taken to evaluate the safety of the identified product produced out of control and determine the appropriate disposition of the product. See Chapter 9. Process Controls, Corrective Action section. Calibration and accuracy checks are different but related concepts. Ideally, a process monitoring instrument used for process control monitoring is both accurate, correct or true, and precise. Result is repeatable or reproducible. The accuracy and precision of a process monitoring instrument or a verification instrument is usually established by comparing the instrument against a traceable reference standard. Accuracy checks determine if the instrument is reading a true or correct value at a single point. Routine accuracy checks of a thermometer used to measure cold temperatures could involve immersing the probe in an ice slurry to determine if the thermometer measures a temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. Boiling water could be used for a thermometer used to measure hot temperatures. Because the boiling point of water varies with altitude, the specific temperature needs to be determined. Calibration involves determining that the value of multiple measurements from a specific instrument are, in fact, correct by comparison to a known calibrated instrument or by comparison with two known standards. For example, a thermometer could be calibrated by comparing it to a National Institute of Standards (NIST) traceable thermometer at two different temperatures within the range the instrument will be used. The two temperatures should be above and below the range. Calibration is typically done less frequently than accuracy checks. Examples of calibration activities and accuracy checks are presented in the slide above. It is important to realize that the accuracy of process monitoring instruments and verification instruments can change. Therefore, it is important to conduct routine accuracy and periodic calibration checks to assure safety and to minimize the need to detain and evaluate the product. A number of factors should be considered when determining the frequency of these activities for process monitoring instrument or verification instrument. The design of the process monitoring instrument or verification instrument must ensure that the instrument is capable of making accurate measurements when used within the expected environmental condition over some reasonable period of time. Calibration frequency depends on the type of instrument used, its condition and past performance, as well as the operating environment in which it will be used. For example, some instruments are affected by temperature or humidity. The reliability and sensitivity of the process monitoring instrument and verification instrument should also be considered when determining the frequency of accuracy checks and calibration. Consistent temperature variations away from the actual value, also referred to as drift, found during accuracy checks or calibrations of an instrument may indicate that more frequent calibration is needed. Drift may also indicate the instrument needs to be replaced, perhaps with a more durable instrument. Additionally, the amount of product that could be produced and considered out of control if an accuracy or calibration check indicated that the process monitoring instrument was not functioning properly should be considered. One of the most frequently used process monitoring instruments and verification instruments for food products is a thermometer. Some factors to consider when determining the frequency for thermometer accuracy checks and calibration include inherent reliability of the instrument. Daily accuracy checks may be needed for the least reliable instruments, including dial thermometers and bimetallic types of thermometers. Periodic checks may be adequate for more reliable instruments, such as digital thermometers, with a history of reliable performance. Manufacturer recommendations for the instrument, the design and expected conditions of use for each individual instrument type is considered when manufacturers make accuracy and calibration recommendations. The manufacturer's information should be used to determine the frequency needed for these activities in the food safety plan. E.g., Food Company uses an infrared surface thermometer to measure the temperature of the cooked omelet as a monitoring activity. Checking the accuracy of the thermometer is therefore important. The food safety team included the following verification activities in the food safety plan to assure that the thermometer was accurate: daily accuracy check for infrared surface thermometer with annual calibration. 21 CFR 117.165B1 states that a facility must have written procedures for the method and frequency of calibrating process monitoring instruments and verification instruments, or checking them for accuracy, are required. In addition, records must be kept documenting the results of accuracy checks and calibrations of process monitoring instruments and verification instruments. These records must be reviewed by a person who has the training or experience necessary to evaluate the results and determine that all of these instruments are accurate and properly calibrated. The regulation does not require records to provide traceability to a reference instrument, but this is a useful practice. See the subsequent section on verification records review. Verification of a preventive control's implementation and effectiveness may also include targeted sampling and testing of ingredients in processed materials and/or finished products. For example, supplier compliance with a standard may be verified by targeted periodic sampling and testing when a supply chain program includes testing of an ingredient or raw material as verification of a supply chain applied control. Like calibration records, verification through testing must be reviewed within a reasonable time after the results are reported. The review or testing reports are part of the facility's verification activities. Examples of periodic targeted sampling and testing for verification purposes may include coliform testing for pasteurized milk products to verify that the process meets requirements for safety and that sanitary practice is adequate. Testing dry corn for aflatoxin, especially when seasonal conditions increase the risk of aflatoxin production. And pesticide residue testing of raw fruits or vegetables used for further processing, especially from new suppliers. When the food safety plan specifies product testing as a verification activity, the 21 CFR 117.165B2 of the regulation states that procedures for that activity must be documented and followed to identify the parameters listed on the slide. It requires that the testing methods used for a verification activity must be scientifically valid. Resources for testing methods include standard methods published by international, regional, or national standards, writing organizations such as the FDA, AOAC, ISO, etc. Documented procedures for the testing program must include microorganism or analyte, identify the specific test microorganisms or other analytes to be evaluated. Testing may be for pathogens or for relevant indicator organisms, which may provide quantitative information, which is potentially more useful to assess the microbiological status of a lot. For example, the pasteurized milk industry has used coliforms as an indicator in milk products for many years, rather than pathogen testing. Adequate pasteurization should destroy coliforms. Thus, detecting coliforms in a pasteurized milk product suggests post-process contamination or inadequate pasteurization conditions. A facility can act on this information, especially if data are analyzed over time, to evaluate trends. Relationship to lots? Specify the procedures for identifying samples, including their relationship to specific lots of the product. For example, if the sample is an ingredient, preferably the analysis is done before the ingredient is used in a product. If not, then it will be necessary to identify which lot of product contained the ingredient. If it is a line sample, the sample may represent product made since the last cleanup. Number of samples, frequency, and analytical unit. Include the procedures for sampling, including the number of samples and the sampling frequency. ICMF 2011 provides considerations and recommendations for microbiological sampling plans for a variety of food products. Analytical test method. Identify the tests conducted, including the analytical methods, PCQIs. The actual test method used must be scientifically valid as discussed above. Ensure that the method has been validated for the specific food under consideration. Method providers may be of assistance in validating the test method. Laboratory. Identify the laboratory conducting the testing. The facility may conduct its own testing if it has the appropriate facilities and trained individuals. Often an outside laboratory is used. Ensure the laboratory has proficiency in working with food samples. Corrective action procedures. Include the corrective action procedures that will be followed if test results do not comply with the standards. Examples of publications by credible organizations with scientifically valid methods for examination of food. American Public Health Association, Compendium of Methods for the Microbiological Examination of Foods. APCHA Standard Methods for the Examination of Dairy Products. FDA Bacteriological Analytical Manual, BAM. FDA Macroanalytical Procedures Manual, MPM. Food Additives, Analytical Manual. Food Chemicals, Codex. International Standards Organization, ISO Methods. Official Methods of Analysis of AOAC International, or Laboratory Information Bulletins, LIBs. Pesticide Analytical Manual, PAM. See additional reading, resources, and references at the end of the chapter for more information. All monitoring and corrective action records must be reviewed by or under the oversight of a preventive controls qualified individual, 21 CFR 117.16504. This review is a verification activity. Records are valuable tools that document that the food safety plan is operating within established safety parameters, and deviations are handled appropriately. However, records alone are meaningless unless someone reviews them on a periodic basis to verify that the critical limits were achieved and the food safety plan is being followed. 21 CFR 117.165A4. I require that monitoring and corrective action records be reviewed within 7 working days after the records are created, or within a reasonable time frame, provided that the preventive controls qualified individual prepared or oversees the preparation of a written justification for a time frame that exceeds 7 working days. When possible, records are reviewed prior to introducing the product into commerce, such as shipping to a customer. This common practice can prevent a potential recall and unintended consequences should a critical limit deviation be discovered during record review. Corrective action must be taken if the record review determines that a deviation has occurred. This is true for sanitation preventive controls records. If, for example, the product is no longer in the facility's control and the lack of proper implementation of the preventive control may lead to a hazard being likely to occur in the product, there is no required time limit to review verification records, such as equipment calibration or testing results. Product testing, environmental monitoring, 21 CFR 117.165A 42 states. These records are to be reviewed within a reasonable time after the records are created. However, it is incumbent on the preventive controls qualified individual or their designee to ensure these records are reviewed in a timely manner in order to successfully respond to any potential issue signaled in this documentation. The value of record review is maximized when data are analyzed to look for trends across the food safety system. For example, are the verification results for one supplier the same as another supplier, or are there differences that warrant investigation? Are listeria indicators isolated with greater frequency in one location? Do sanitation verification results indicate higher counts on one line or in one area? If a trend emerges during record review, further investigation or adjustments may be warranted to minimize the potential for a future deviation. A rigorous verification program can be the basis for continuous improvement of operations and lead to a more effective food safety system and often more efficient operations. Reviewing, monitoring, and corrective action records is required to be performed by or overseen by the preventive controls qualified individual. The record review verifies that all required monitoring and corrective action information has been documented, including signatures of the individuals performing monitoring and corrective action activities. The information documented on the record must be accurate and reasonable, meaning that the record reflects the actual events in the facility occurring at times that make sense. Record review must also ensure that the particular activity followed the monitoring and corrective action procedures explicitly. The actions must have been completed in the appropriate sequence and meet the current critical limit and effective corrective actions for the preventive control. The verification activity of reviewing the monitoring and corrective action records is another element of a food safety plan that requires documentation. Identification of the individual conducting the review and the date the review occurred must be recorded. Identifying information of the individual conducting the review can be either their signature or initials, provided the initials can be connected to a specific individual. The record review information can be recorded directly on the monitoring or corrective action record or on a separate form, as long as the verification action can be connected to the specific monitoring record appropriately. The example from E.G. Food Company uses the corrective action record to document the verification activity of record review. FS Leader reviewed the information entered by the packaging line supervisor to ensure that the description of the incident was clear and that the corrective actions taken were consistent with those described in the process preventive control chart. Verification of monitoring records follows the same process. An example of a monitoring record review is discussed later in slide 40. There are other forms of verification that can be performed in addition to the ones already discussed. Direct observation of the preventive control monitoring activities by the supervisor or another designated individual while those activities are being performed verifies that the activity is properly completed. Process control checks, such as checking that the equipment settings are correct, can help ensure that the process will function correctly. Verification activities can be completed at a frequency greater than what is required in the food safety plan as an aid to verifying that the process is operating as intended. Audits of and reanalysis of the food safety plan can also serve as verification activities. More discussion of these concepts is found in Chapter 14. Building upon the examples from previous chapters, verification and validation concepts are applied. The nut roasting step is validated using a Grocery Manufacturers Association, GMA, 2016 publication on safe processing of nuts, which was verified by checking product temperatures, calibrating equipment, and reviewing records. Wash water chlorination is validated using a UC Davis publication and verified via the accuracy checks and review of corrective actions and records. Frequency and the individuals responsible for these actions are also described. The pasta chilling step is validated using a 1994 FDA publication on Bacillus cereus characteristics and verified by reviewing pasta cooling logs along with calibration and accuracy checks of thermometers. Metal detection is validated using technical information from the manufacturer and verified by accuracy and calibration checks and by review of records. The frequency and the persons responsible for these actions are also noted. The E.G. Food Company Food Safety Plan teaching example also includes other examples of verification for sanitation and allergen preventive controls. An example of the process control verification activities performed by the E.G. Food Company is illustrated above in the verification column. Verification activities of the cook step include 1. Review of the cook log, corrective action, and verification records within 7 working days. 2. Daily accuracy checks of the infrared surface thermometer. 3. Annual calibration of the infrared surface thermometer. 4. Product testing. And 5. Cook validation study. The procedures used to perform these verification activities should be documented and can be found in Appendix 3. Record keeping for process preventive controls. Accurate record keeping is an essential part of a successful preventive control system, providing proof that the plan was implemented as intended and establishing a history of the process and product. In general, there are 2 types of required records in the preventive controls for human food regulation. 1. The food safety plan itself, and 2. Implementation records. All of these documents can be reviewed and copied by regulatory personnel. The components of a food safety plan were discussed in earlier chapters. The items listed on the slide are required as part of the food safety plan. Implementation records document the actual performance of the food safety plan. In other words, implementation records demonstrate that the control steps from the food safety plan were completed. Remember in Chapter 2, Slide 7, we discussed having training records for qualified individuals for food hygiene, and food safety training is required as outlined in 21 CFR 117.4 B2 and D. According to the regulation, food safety plan implementation, records include monitoring records, all of the data collected from monitoring activity at the given process, preventive control, corrective action records, records for each time a corrective action was taken, verification records, validation, which is the documentation that provides support for validity, a process preventive control, verification of monitoring. This will often be a sign-off on the monitoring record itself. Verification of corrective actions. This will be a sign-off on the corrective action record. Calibration of process monitoring and verification instruments. Product testing. Records review. And reanalysis, discussed in Chapter 14. And applicable training records for preventive controls, qualified individuals. Implementation records may include information used for validation and decision-making during hazard analysis, such as published scientific studies and facility studies done by technical experts and data from other experts, such as trade associations, equipment manufacturers, or sanitation chemical providers. Documentation of verification activities associated with the supply chain program, such as ingredient testing or supplier audits, also represent implementation records. This will be discussed in Chapter 13. Organizing implementation records in a logical manner is recommended to facilitate retrieval during inspection or when an incident requiring investigation occurs. All records must be kept as originals, true copies, or in an electronic format. True copies include photocopies, pictures, scanned copies, microfilm, microfiche, or other accurate reproductions of originals. Monitoring and verification records associated with the food safety plan must include the actual values or observation. For example, if a temperature is being measured, the specific temperature measured must be recorded rather than a check mark indicating that the temperature complied with the critical limit. All entries must be accurately recorded in a permanent manner that can be read and not easily altered. For example, records cannot be recorded in pencil because they can be easily changed later if recorded in pencil. The monitoring and verification information must be recorded at the time observed. In other words, it is not acceptable to walk out onto the production area, observe practices, and then go back to an office area to record the observations. To comply with the regulations, the information needs to be recorded at the same time the activity is being performed. General requirements are in Subpart F of the Preventive Controls for Human Food Regulation. Attached in the Chapter 10, Resources. The Food Safety Plan and implementation records must include basic information to provide a history of the actions performed. Basic information for records includes the name of the record, the name and, when necessary, location of the facility, the date and, when appropriate, time that the activity was documented, the actual measurements or observations made, when applicable, where appropriate, the identity of the product and the lot code, if any. For many records, product identification and a lot identification code may be relevant, but for some processes, such as pre-operational sanitation records, the time and the date are adequate. And initials or signatures of individuals performing monitoring and verification activities are also required. Electronic or computerized records are acceptable in a preventive control system as long as they are equivalent to paper records, and electronic signatures are equivalent to traditional handwritten signatures. Electronic signatures must be unique to each individual user. Controls are necessary to ensure that electronic records are authentic, accurate, and protected from unauthorized changes. If a firm intends to implement an electronic record-keeping system, factors that must be included in the design and implementation of the system include electronic records must be reviewed by management with adequate frequency to ensure the facility's food safety plan is being followed, and electronic records must be available for review and copying by regulatory authorities upon request. If a company decides to use an electronic or computerized record-keeping system, the system should be validated, just like any other process or piece of equipment. Recent advances in electronic communications make the use of portable electronic instruments beneficial to reduce the amount of paper records that must be kept in a food safety system. Each monitoring record must be designed to capture the measurements or observations for parameters and associated values, such as critical limits for the preventive control. The actual measurement or observation must be documented on the record. The date the measurement or observation was made must be documented on the record. The signature or initials of the person who made the monitoring observation must also be recorded. The record should have a title or other identifier that corresponds to the record described in the food safety plan. Accurate record keeping provides documentation that food safety hazards are being controlled. False or inaccurate records filled out before the actual operation takes place, or those that are completed later, may lead to regulatory and legal action, especially if found to be fraudulent. A signature or initials from the individual who verified that the record complied with required parameters and associated values, as well as the date of the verification review was completed, must be documented. Record review verification actions can be documented on the monitoring record or on a separate record that can be connected to the verification action. These verification procedures were discussed in greater detail earlier in this chapter. Signature or initials of persons signing off on the record must be traceable to the person who did the sign-off, so they must be legible. This form, the cook temperature log, documents the periodic monitoring of omelet surface temperature at each omelet cook station to document if the critical limit is met. The initials of the person monitoring the temperature is documented, as well as the name and signature or initial of the person verifying the monitoring record. This example record is used to continuously monitor the operations of a refrigerated product's storage cooler. The temperature record is periodically checked visually and initialed by the operator to ensure compliance with the critical limit. Notice the back of the chart is used to record the information required on all monitoring records, such as the name and location of the company, the name of the form, and includes the verification information, the record review date, and the verifier's name and signature or initials. Remember that the verification activity should include more than just signing the chart. Observation of trends by comparing different days is very useful for identifying issues before corrective action is required. Exception records only provide a record when there is loss of control at a process, preventive control. The regulation 21 CRF 117.145C2 allows for records based on an exception in certain circumstances. The regulation states, records of refrigeration temperature during storage of food that requires time temperature control to significantly minimize or prevent the growth of or toxin production by pathogens may be affirmative records. Demonstrating temperature is controlled, or exception records, demonstrating loss of temperature control. Exception records may be adequate in circumstances other than monitoring refrigeration temperature. Other examples may include the finding of foreign material when an X-ray unit detects it. In this case, the critical limit is not generating a record, but when the critical limit is not met, a record is generated by the equipment, as in the X-ray machine. It is important to demonstrate that the system designed to generate exception records function properly, so then, when an exception occurs, it is detected. A corrective action record describes the deviation that triggered corrective action and captures the following: product identification, such as the product description, lot codes covered, and amount of product on hold. Summary of the root cause of the deviation and actions taken to prevent further occurrences. Results of the evaluation or testing of product placed on hold, if necessary, and the final disposition of the product. Name and signature of the person responsible for the corrective action, and name and signature of the person reviewing the corrective actions. Report. A sample corrective action record is illustrated above. Some facilities may have a root cause field on the form and have a root cause analysis performed. See Appendix 8 for the definitions of root cause and root cause analysis. The records of validation discussed earlier in this chapter provide a scientific basis that the parameters and preventive controls in the food safety plan will control relevant hazards. Validation answers questions such as, are we doing what we should be doing? Are the preventive controls and the parameters and values, or critical limits at CCPs, adequate to significantly minimize or prevent food safety concerns? Is there new information that should be considered regarding the safety of products, such as emerging hazards? Can the lack of customer or consumer complaints, when the firm has a system to collect them, be used to indicate that there is no history of a food safety concern. Many sources of information can be used to validate a food safety plan. Some validation options include studies done by process authorities, such as a person or institution with expert knowledge and experience to make determinations about the safety of a food process and formulation. In-facility studies or challenge studies conducted on the specific product, trade association summaries on emerging hazards, university or research institution, reports and studies, peer-reviewed journal articles, and regulatory or other guidance documents. Records supporting validation decisions made by the facility must be maintained. If a validation of a preventive control is determined to not be applicable, the preventive control's qualified individual prepares or oversees the preparation of a written justification that validation is not applicable based on factors such as the nature of the hazard and the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system. Records generated by third parties also must meet the requirements for records. Examples may include validation studies, calibration records, product testing, and environmental monitoring when conducted by a consultant or outside lab. Records of verification activities must be kept in order to demonstrate that the food safety plan has been implemented properly, the monitoring measurements or observations are accurate and reliable, and the food safety system is working as intended. Different records may be needed to capture the verification information that is specified in the food safety plan. Examples of verification activities requiring frequent records include logs that document the results of checks to verify the accuracy of thermometers, pH meters, or other process monitoring instruments used to monitor critical limits and other parameters. Monitoring records by a trained individual under the oversight of a preventive controls qualified individual to verify that parameters were met and appropriate corrective actions were taken. Examples of less frequently used but also important records for verification activities might include logs that document calibration, activities for the thermometers, pH meters, and other process monitoring instruments mentioned above, results of finished product microbiological, chemical, or physical tests, results of equipment evaluation tests, heat penetration or temperature distribution for ovens, fryers, or other equipment. Reanalysis activities, such as a report describing modifications made to the food safety plan because of a change in products, ingredients, formulations, processes, packaging, or distribution methods. This example form demonstrates how a company may document daily accuracy checks of all thermometers used in the daily process monitoring operations. The form could be modified to include a procedure number for the work instructions directing the daily accuracy check steps. Note that the thermometer sensitivity should be based on the thermometer manufacturer's stated sensitivity. An ice bath would be appropriate to check thermometers used for cold temperatures. If boiling water is used, the temperature for the altitude at the location also should be indicated. Instead of using the heading boiling water check, a standard operating procedure could be referenced or other descriptive terminology. This form could be used to document the calibration check of process monitoring instruments and verification instruments, such as thermometers, on an annual basis. As mentioned previously, the facility needs to determine the frequency with which such activities are conducted. Thermometer calibration may occur on a quarterly basis, a monthly basis, an annual basis, or other frequency deemed appropriate for the type of thermometer and other considerations. Product testing as a verification activity was mentioned earlier in this chapter. The results of those tests are verification records. If appropriate, corrective actions taken in response to the product testing results will be required to be documented in records. Note: a result that says negative or not detected also should include the analytical unit, grams, milliliter, per swab, etc., in order to determine the sensitivity of the test. Data from in-facility or external laboratory testing should be maintained in original records and be documented. Date of the tests, test microorganism or other analyte, sample identification, including relationship to specific lots of product, the sampling procedure, including the number of samples and the sampling frequency, the tests conducted, including the analytical methods used, the laboratory conducting the tests, results of the tests, and corrective action records as appropriate. An example of a product testing record is in Appendix 3 and the Chapter 10 resources. Building on examples of process controls from previous chapters, records from nut roasting and produce wash water steps are included here. Continuing to build on examples of process control records from previous chapters, the pasta chilling and metal detection steps are included here. The slide shows E.G. Food Company's food safety plan. You can find the complete example in Appendix 3. The food safety plan teaching example illustrates how implementation records could be referenced in a food safety plan in the records column. The name of the record for recording monitoring activity is included. Corrective action and verification record titles also are referenced, including the validation study for the cook step. The preventive controls for human food regulation requires that food safety related records must be retained for a minimum of 2 years from the date the record was created. Records that relate to the general adequacy of the equipment or processes being used, including the scientific studies and evaluations, must be kept at the facility for at least 2 years after their use is discontinued. The food safety plan must be retained on site. Electronic records are considered to be on site if they are accessible from on site. Other records, such as monitoring records, may be stored off-site if they are readily available within 24 hours when requested for official review, e.g., by the FDA. All records associated with the food safety plan must be available to the FDA regulatory personnel or their designee for inspection. Verification and validation are essential elements of an effective food safety plan. The initial and subsequent validation of the plan must be performed or overseen by a preventive controls qualified individual to ensure that the controls identified will control the hazards that are likely to be present in the food. Without such controls, verification activities are conducted to determine if and document that the food safety plan is being implemented as designed. People are doing what is expected, and records are available to demonstrate ongoing performance. The record review activities must be performed or overseen by a preventive controls qualified individual. Records are an essential component of a food safety preventive control system. Records must be established for each process preventive control and include required parameters and values, monitoring records, which must be created as the activity takes place, and include information about the procedures, what, how, the frequency, and by whom, and corrective action records identifying the implicated product and how it was dispositioned correcting the deviation so it is not likely to recur, and ensuring that the process preventive control is functioning properly. Note that corrections may be appropriate in certain instances. Verification records also are required. All records must be permanent, e.g. in indelible ink with no erasures, and electronic records can be used if they meet requirements. Required records must be verified by an individual under the oversight of a preventive controls qualified individual. Upon request, all records associated with the food safety plan must be made available for inspection by the FDA or its designee. You have completed the lecture for Chapter 10. Be sure to complete the knowledge check as well as the Chapter 10 exercise. See you in Chapter 11.